The key to understanding the amazing paintings of Marc Chagall lies in his childhood. You will be surprised at how simple and obvious their meaning will become after I tell you the real story of his life, which you are unlikely to find in Russian sources, and soon you will understand why. Let's go. Marc Chagall, born Moishe Sigal, was born on July 6, 1887 into a Jewish family in Lyozna near Vitebsk, now Belarus. At the time, it was a new part of the Russian Empire, acquired about 100 years before the artist's birth after the partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Along with the vast territory, Russia acquired large Jewish settlements, which had not existed in Russia before. And to prevent competition with Russian merchants and craftsmen, Jews were ordered to live in ghettos, which were called the Pale of Settlement. Jews were strictly forbidden to leave the settlements, and even more strictly to enter the capitals and provincial centers. For this, a special visa was required. An exception was made only for certain professions: merchants of the First Guild, people with higher education, and those who had served in the army. Jewish children were forbidden to study in general education schools, and a quota of no more than 10% was set for Jews in universities, even within the settlements. In the capitals, the quota was only 3% to prevent Jews from entering public service. In other words, Jewish families in 19th century Russia were almost completely isolated, facing severe discrimination and being deprived of their rights, which led to severe overcrowding in the settlements and widespread poverty. Marc Chagall was born into a relatively poor family and was the oldest of 9 children. His father worked as a loader and traded herring. He carried herring barrels, earning 20 rubles a month, while the average Russian herring worker made 13 rubles a month. His mother managed the household. She sold groceries from home in a grocery shop that was right in their house. Vitebsk was quite inexpensive. Vitebsk was big. At that time, the city had a population of 66,000 people, half of whom were Jewish. Vitebsk was called the Russian Toledo. It was a picturesque town with churches, synagogues, squares and wooden houses, which unfortunately did not survive after World War II. And it was precisely the childhood memories of the Jewish community in Vitebsk, shaped by nostalgia and vivid impressions, that would become the foundation for all of the artist's work. The Chagall family had their own small farm, a horse, a cow, chickens and goats, which would become the favorite subjects in the artist's paintings. I will read you a description of Vitebsk from the artist's autobiography, My Life, which I recently read and which will probably give the most important key to understanding his work. This description shares what the artist saw, the environment he lived in, and the people he met, all from his perspective. I will try to help you picture the simple and charming life of the young Chagall, which is the foundation and main motif of his paintings. In the houses next to ours lived other families, each with their own concerns. Right behind us was the house of the cart driver. He worked no less than his horse. The hard-working animal did its best, pulling the heavy cart, but the cart driver strained himself even more. Lanky and skinny, taller than the horse, longer than the cart. He earned little. His wife illegally sold alcohol, but her husband secretly drank almost all the vodka by himself. And then there was no hope for peace and quiet, because he couldn't sing. Напротив стоял покосившийся домишко. Tanka lived there, a laundress and a thief. And on the other side lived the stovemaker with his wife and a bunch of kids. From morning till night, loud quarrels could be heard from there. At times, after yelling at her husband as much as she wanted, the wife would come out to sit on the bench and get some fresh air. If I left the house then too, she would shake her head as if to say, "See what a scoundrel he is? But if you listen to him, he sounds right." To the left, in another small wooden house, lived 2 people, or really 1.5, as one was a dwarf. They traded horses and also stole pigeons, luring them out of other people's pigeon lofts and taking them away in flight. They often bothered passers-by on the street. Once, when I was very little, I even thought that one of them wanted to take me away with him. Next to the stovemaker lived the baker's family, the most respectable on our street. Their windows were lit by 5 a.m. and smoke rose from the chimney as the kitchen stove burned at full blast. In just an hour or two, whole baskets of excellent freshly baked rolls would be ready. I would run there early in the morning and come out happy with a couple of hot crescent rolls. As you can see in his book, his memoirs, and in his works, he creates a pastoral picture of the picturesque, peaceful life of ordinary people, the Jewish community being one of them himself. Chagall's parents were deeply religious people, so the artist's early life was steeped in following the Kabbalah, rituals, and traditions that tried to survive in a hostile environment with Vitebsk as their center. Chagall admits that through his paintings he wanted to preserve this disappearing culture that was so close to him, one of the most important aspects of which, of course, was Jewish music. No event, whether it was a wedding, a birthday, Purim, or Hanukkah, went without klezmers, wandering musicians whose leader was always the violinist. The violinist always led the wedding procession. His music had to be expressive. At first it was sad, so the bride could mourn her departing youth, and then it became wildly joyful for dancing. Musicians were almost the only entertainment for the townspeople. And soon, the violinist and the violin, even in the hands of animals, would become perhaps the most frequent guests in Chagall's paintings, symbolizing a spiritual separation from the grey everyday life, the elevation of creativity above the ordinary routine of the city. But enough digressions. I hope I managed to create in your mind the image of that very Vitebsk, as Chagall remembered it and painted it in his incomparable colors. Chagall was a thin and awkward child, unlike his father, which made him practically unfit for all kinds of physical work and at the same time served as a justification for the step the future artist would take a little later. Until the age of 13, he studied at the local Jewish religious school because, as I mentioned, Jewish children were not allowed to attend regular schools. But when he turned 13, his mother managed to get him into a general education school by giving a 50-ruble bribe to the principal. That's 3 months of the family's income. However, this advancement didn't make Marc happy at all. Suddenly, he developed a speech defect, stuttering, that started to show up when he panicked, like when he was called to the blackboard, and it would stay with him for the rest of his life. This is also an important aspect. As a result, Chagall excelled in subjects where he didn't have to speak, like geometry and drawing, but was completely useless in others, getting nothing but failing grades. And then one day, Marc saw how his classmate brought some amazing drawings to school. Chagall was very interested in them. These weren't just drawing assignments, but whole stories with plots. Until that moment, Chagall didn't even know the word artist. Well, they didn't have any artists, and rural conversations never even touched on such matters. When Marc asked him how he did it, his classmate said that he borrowed books from the library and copied the illustrations from them. Chagall was literally amazed by this innovation, transferring what you see onto paper, telling stories with pictures without resorting to stuttering speech, creating a narrative with your hands instead of your voice. And he follows his classmate's example, borrows books from the library, starts enthusiastically copying the illustrations, and soon people start calling him an artist. But not yet because he was good, but because he simply couldn't resist drawing. And by the age of 18, Chagall decides that drawing is exactly what he wants to do for the rest of his life. He comes across a new school in the city run by the realist artist Yehuda Pen and goes to his mother to shock her with the sudden announcement that he wants to become an artist. An artist? For his mother and for everyone in his circle who dealt with herring and cattle, this statement sounded almost as if he wanted to become a stamp collector. A completely impractical, incomprehensible occupation, obviously leading down an utterly inevitable road to poverty. And Chagall's bewildered mother took his drawings and went to Pen, hoping that he would simply reject her son, and the matter would be settled. However, after looking at Marc's sketches, Pen decided that there was a spark of talent in them and agreed to take him on as an apprentice, even for free in exchange for work in the studio, which, by the way, was a common practice. So, to the disappointment of his mother and the whole family, Chagall became an artist's apprentice, although this did not last long. As you can already see, realism and academic art were not his style at all. His mother and sisters did not understand this absurd choice at all. But they really liked Chagall's canvases. They were sturdy and made excellent floor mats. Marc often found them being used this way when he came home. Chagall remembers his mother and his family very fondly. And as an adult, he found this rather amusing, highlighting just how ridiculous his pursuits seemed to those around him. And it was at Penn School that Chagall had a fateful encounter. I think you've already noticed from my videos that very often great artists escape poverty by meeting someone who is able to pull them up from the very bottom and show their talent to the world. He meets Penn's young student, Victor Meckler, the son of a very wealthy merchant. They were from two completely different social strata that would never cross paths in ordinary life. But Chagall was more talented, and Meckler asked him to help with drawing and offered to pay him. But Marc offered him a deal, friendship in exchange for help. That's how these two completely different people became friends. And Chagall gained access to high society, often visiting the luxurious home of the Meckler family, and for the first time, taking part in conversations about art and culture. A year later, both guys decided it was time to move on. Meckler planned to go to St. Petersburg to continue his studies, but Chagall didn't have any money. Besides, Meckler came from a first guild merchant family and had the right to leave the city. Chagall, on the other hand, did not have such a right. But Meckler offered his help with the move and some money to get started. Chagall went to his father to ask for permission to leave, and his father reluctantly agreed, irritably tossing 27 rubles under the table. That was all he was willing to do to help his son, declaring that he would not sponsor his crazy ideas. However, he did help his son arrange a permit to leave the city by asking that same herring merchant to register his trip as a business trip. And 20-year-old Chagall left his native Vitebsk for the first time and went to the northern capital, a huge and noisy city, one he would never have dared to go to alone. But to live there, he needed another permit, and soon this desperate adventure would end in arrest. St. Petersburg in 1907 was both a paradise and a hellish place at the same time. Carriages of the wealthy ride along the electrically lit Nevsky Prospect, heading to the Mariinsky Theater. The first movie theaters are opening. In the art world, mysticism and cabaret are becoming fashionable, and poets recite their verses in art cafes. But the first Russian Revolution has just ended. It has been suppressed, and the reaction is gaining strength. Stolypin's activities and the military field courts are in full swing, hanging people indiscriminately. They put so-called Stolypin neckties, nooses, on the suspects. The police are carrying out mass raids and crackdowns on those living in the city illegally. And Jews in the northern capital were allowed to stay for no more than 24 hours without special permission. Chagall submits his sketches to the School of the Society for the Encouragement of the Arts, headed by Nikolai Rerik. And 1 out of 4 wins a scholarship program with a stipend of 10 rubles a month. That's a very small amount of money for the capital, so he has to live on tea and bread and share one bed with a craftsman in a tiny rented room. However, at school, he's once again taught academic art. He's made to draw plaster figures and is given the basics of classicism techniques. And Chagall feels from the very beginning that this is sterile, conservative art. It washes out those colors, that bright color palette, which made up his very nature as an artist. Meanwhile, early signs of the avant-garde began emerging in cultural life. Traditional academic painting began to seem dead and boring to the youth, including Chagall and Meckler. With a significant delay, ideas that were born in distant Paris reached Russia and began to take root. Lev Bakst and Alexander Benoit set the tone in painting and theater. And it was Lev Bakst whom Chagall dreamed of studying under, considering him the main authority. Chagall knocked on the doors of various patrons, hoping to enlist the support of a wealthy benefactor who could support the artist in the early stages. This was quite a common practice. Wealthy patrons often sponsored young talents. It was considered very prestigious and sometimes even profitable. Viktor Meckler introduced him to his relative, who in turn introduced Marc to Grigory Abramov, a well-known lawyer and public figure, also a Jew. He decided to help Chagall and arranged a fake position for him as a supposed footman in his house. Such an arrangement was only allowed under the terms of that legal arrangement. The footman had to eat and live in the master's house without leaving its premises. So one fine day, Chagall was caught by the police during another raid as he was returning from school and was thrown into jail, where he spent 2 weeks with beggars and criminals. Goldberg had to use all his influence to get Chagall out, and after that, the frightened artist decided to officially obtain legal status. And with Goldberg's help again, he got a job at a sign-making workshop. At school, Chagall met the daughter of another well-known wealthy Jewish lawyer, Maxim Berson, Alia Berson. They became friends, and Chagall started helping her with painting. He could no longer live with Goldberg, although they remained on very good terms. In the end, Alia made arrangements with her father so that Chagall could live with them as a poor relative. So the artist lived in the home of a wealthy family and went to school, where the teachers were not very pleased with his progress. He was constantly experimenting, and academicism does not tolerate experiments. That's what academicism is all about. All the rules of painting are written down and must be strictly followed. And of course, this path was very far from the manner and style of Chagall. But in St. Petersburg, there was another, the most prestigious private school in the capital, Zvantseva's school, where Lev Bakst, whom Chagall revered, and Mstislav Dobujinsky taught. Chagall turned to Bakst only after failing to get in elsewhere. He simply had no other choice left. He brought his Vitebsk works for the review. Bakst, also a Jew, already a world-famous artist and the chief artist for Diaghilev's Russian seasons, looked at the sketches and said his famous phrase, "Your works are very interesting, you have talent, but you've been badly spoiled already. You need to forget everything and start over." This school was considered the most progressive in Russia, with the latest Parisian trends. But studying there cost an unthinkable 30 rubles a month. Neither Chagall nor his father ever had that kind of money. And Maxim Besson, the father of Alia, who enrolled in this school, agreed to sponsor Chagall's education. That's how it usually happens, my friends. If you discriminate against a group, it only becomes more united. In the same way, Chagall's Jewish background, on one hand, served as a stigma and an unfair limitation of any rights, but on the other hand, it created truly incredible connections that literally drew the young Jew into the high society of the northern capital. Because it was at Bakst's school that he met Nijinsky and Countess Tolstaya. And it was this school that would pave the way for Chagall to distant progressive Paris, the world capital of art and the dream of every artist of that time. Bakst, a master of theatrical set design, motivated Chagall by serving as a role model for Jewish success. Creating theater sets was seen as a prestigious job. Through Bakst, Chagall was introduced to experimental theater. And this acquaintance, many years later, would lead him to decorate the Paris Opera. Bakst's school marked a turning point in Chagall's creative work. Bakst often traveled to Paris and brought back new ideas, telling a lot about Matisse, who was making waves in Paris at the time, and about the fauves with their wild, twisted, and improbable colors. And it was precisely this bright use of color that was bursting from Chagall's nature, constantly suppressed by the conservatism of academic art. Somewhere far away in Paris, the very thing Chagall himself wanted to do and felt deeply was happening and becoming popular. The dream of going to Paris became an obsession for the young artist. However, there were also conflicts. Bakst was an aesthete. He loved sophistication, while Chagall showed his provincial, simple, and even rough approach. Bakst constantly criticized Chagall for incorrect anatomy in his paintings. Chagall, on the other hand, snapped back that the truth of life is more important than incorrect proportions. As we already know, this is exactly what will make him one of the most famous artists in Europe. In 1910, Bakst is getting ready to go to Paris again, this time for good, accompanying Diaghilev's Russian ballets. And Chagall, who had already heard about the Impressionists and the artist who cut off his own ear, begged to be taken along, even if it was just to paint the backdrops of the sets. Bakst agreed and even gave him 100 rubles to learn to prime stage sets. But the result did not satisfy him, and he refused, saying, "You have talent, but you don't know how to obey. In Paris, you will either get lost or become a nobody." This hurt Chagall deeply. His dream was being taken away from right under his nose. And he returns to Vitebsk again, where, as if compensating for his loss, he paints everyone he can, eagerly searching for distinctive models, grabbing strangers from the street and placing them at the center of his whimsical compositions. And soon he finds the woman who would become his lifelong model. He meets Bella Rosenfeld, the daughter of wealthy jewelers who owned 3 jewelry stores in Vitebsk. Chagall, with his romantic curls and ascetic face, was very popular with the ladies, but he was awkward and shy. At first, he met Bella's friend, who was crazy about him, but she couldn't get him to be intimate with her. After meeting Bella, Chagall instantly knew she was the woman he wanted to spend his life with. The friend was immediately forgotten, and Bella reciprocated his feelings, much to the displeasure of her wealthy parents, who saw the penniless artist from a loader's family as a very undesirable match. But, as with any Jewish woman, it turned out to be absolutely impossible to change the mind of the love-struck Bella. However, the unknown Chagall had nothing to offer Bella yet, and inspired by love, Chagall returned to St. Petersburg to become someone. And in Petersburg, the Jewish mafia continued its effective work for its own people, and among the wealthy Jews of the capital, rumors began to spread about a young and very talented Jewish artist from Vitebsk. And Chagall was introduced to a man who would change his fate and make possible the Chagall we know today. This was Maxim Venava, a Jew and a deputy of the State Duma, the publisher of the magazine Voskod, which supported national art and a perceptive patron of the arts. They were introduced by that same old friend from Vitebsk, Victor Mekler, and Chagall soon showed up in Venava's luxurious office with rolls of his paintings without stretchers, which he simply couldn't afford. Unlike everyone else in St. Petersburg, who considered Chagall's style primitive, Venava was immediately captivated by the stories and colors that Chagall's paintings told. Venava considered it his mission to develop Jewish art, and he was searching for true talents who could make Jewish painting shine. And it seems that at that very moment, he found it. This was not simple patronage. It was a clear, pragmatic deal, sponsorship in exchange for authority in the art world, which every patron received after discovering a pearl in the muck. As well as the rise of Jewish cultural influence, he even bought 2 paintings by Chagall, and that was his first sale for an incredible 800 rubles. But in Russia, Chagall's paintings didn't interest anyone. All this Jewish folk art, the animalism and primitivism of Chagall's paintings, was seen by the art crowd as backward. Russian art in 1910 was on the verge of an explosion. The Peredvizhniki, along with realism, were losing their influence and were considered outdated. New trends and the search for new forms were coming to replace them, led by Bakst and Benoit with their organization World of Art. The Jack of Diamonds exhibition was about to open, where Mikhail Larionov, Natalia Goncharova and Pyotr Konchalovsky would challenge society. They were rethinking art in a new Lubbock style and bright Fauvist colors, creating a new proto-populism, a return to Russian roots in a new way. In 1910, Kandinsky would paint his first abstraction, shifting art from the representational to the non-representational and beginning the movement toward Malevich's Black Square, with whom Chagall would soon clash. In other words, the Russian art world was changing rapidly. It was rejecting old art and it seemed moving closer to Chagall's style. But Chagall was a storyteller. Each of his paintings was a fantasy and moreover based on a Jewish theme. But the artists of the new movement rejected any kind of narrative. To them, it seemed like a legacy of old art, too simple a way to reach the viewer, too straightforward. While agreeing with Chagall and even following him in form, they diverged from him in terms of content. Chagall sometimes attended art gatherings and took part in discussions, but he never liked loud arguments. He was always an individualist, believing that one should learn from the originators of ideas. And they lived in distant and seemingly unreachable Paris. And at the end of 1910, Venava, seeing Chagall's struggles, suggested to him, "You know what? Why don't you go to Paris? You'll suffocate here. I will give you a small monthly subsidy and you can study and paint there." And he gave him a scholarship, 125 francs, which was very modest, but enough to live on in Paris. And at the age of 23, Chagall, for the first time in his life under the protection of Venava, gets a passport and goes to Paris, where the legendary Larouche is waiting for him. Arriving in Paris, Chagall immediately went to an exhibition of independent artists and realized how far Russia lagged behind the most advanced artistic thought. In those years, French art was dominated by Cubism, which meant analyzing objects from the real world and breaking them down into parts. The Cubists, at the height of their fame and led by Picasso and Braque, were arrogant and considered themselves pioneers of new art, looking down on any other styles. Chagall's art, on the other hand, was almost the opposite of the cold, analytical Cubism, placing the artist's sentimentality and imagination, as well as the story being told, above new forms and painting techniques. That's why even here in Paris, his art was not understood. His Jewish and moreover Russian motifs were seen as archaic and culturally alien. He settled in the famous Larouche. This building in Montparnasse was designed by Gustave Eiffel as a temporary pavilion for wine. In the 1910s, it turned into a dormitory where immigrant artists lived for next to nothing. The rooms in Larouche were tiny and shaped like segments of a circle. In winter, it was unbearably cold there, and in summer, it was stuffy. Chagall lived in one of these cells, where the bed, easel and table stood right next to each other. The money from Venava was barely enough for rent and a little food. When he ran out of canvases, he painted on his nightshirts, sheets and even tablecloths that he had brought from home. Many of his masterpieces from the Paris period are based on ordinary household fabric. His neighbors were future legends as well, Amedeo Modigliani, Chaim Soutine and Fernand Léger. But even among them, he was considered an oddball because he always painted his pictures naked so as not to stain his precious clothes. In Paris, he saw the original paintings of the Impressionists and Fauvists with their bright colors, and his palette changed. He adopted some elements of Cubism, starting to mix objects and characters in his paintings, adding Cubist angularity to them, but the narrative aspect of his paintings never disappeared. The Cubist elements remain just a form that complements the story, not an end in themselves. At first, it was hard for him. He didn't know the language, had no friends, and was generally an uncommunicative stutterer. Can you imagine what it was like in 1910 to come from a remote village to Paris and try to stay afloat in this boiling mix of new ideas and talent? It was here in the Hive that another fateful meeting took place. He was visited by a Russian revolutionary in exile who wrote about new art for Russian newspapers. He was curious to see the Russian eccentric who painted strange pictures while naked. This was Anatoly Lunacharsky, and he was the first person to wholeheartedly appreciate the whimsical imagination in Chagall's paintings. Chagall entered the La Palette Academy, an avant-garde art school, and also found a job at another academy. He spent his free time visiting galleries, salons, especially the Louvre. Among the artists he admired were Rembrandt, Van Gogh, Renoir, Pissarro, Matisse, Monet, and Delacroix. Chagall was delighted and often walked along the banks of the Seine. Everything in the French capital was so new to him and filled him with wonder. The shops, the smell of fresh bread in the mornings, the markets with fresh fruits and vegetables, the wide boulevards, the cafes and restaurants, and above all, of course, the Eiffel Tower. And there was one huge advantage here. Nobody really cared whether he was Jewish or not. Here, for the first time, he felt like an equal, not a second-class person, but still, nobody bought his paintings. And the second person from whom he received praise was the poet Apollinaire, the main critic and spokesman of the Paris art circles at that time, mind you. By that time, Chagall had developed a whole repertoire of whimsical motifs, ghostly figures floating in the sky, a giant violinist dancing on miniature dollhouses, livestock of unexpected colors, and transparent wombs with tiny babies sleeping upside down inside them. He absorbed the wild colors of Fauvism, the angular shapes and gradients of Cubism, but stayed true to himself. Most of his scenes from life in Vitebsk were painted while he was living in Paris. Their whimsical, sentimental undertone of longing for home impressed Apollinaire, who called them surrealistic. And this was the first time the word surrealism was used in relation to a painting. That is why Chagall, among other things, is considered one of the forefathers of surrealism. Despite his vibrant life in Paris and obvious progress in his art, Chagall missed Russia and Bella very much. And then something happens that will become both tragic and pivotal in Chagall's life. Chagall exhibits his works at the Salon des Indépendants. It was the largest Parisian exhibition for avant-garde, young, unrecognized artists, and it was visited by a wealthy German gallerist, Gerward Bolden. He was amazed at how much Chagall's paintings stood out from everything else at the exhibition. Where artistic experiments with form prevailed, Chagall offered entire stories, visions, and the naive, almost childlike fantasies of an artist, which fit perfectly into the emerging style of Expressionism, a style where emotions come to the forefront. And for Apollinaire, who was acquainted with the gallery owner, it wasn't difficult at all to literally sell Chagall to him, convincing the German that this crazy Russian was the future of world art. And Bolden decides to take a risk and offers the completely unknown Chagall a solo exhibition in Berlin. And not every artist was honored with a solo exhibition. It was a huge honor and a rare opportunity. Of course, Chagall agrees and takes to Berlin almost everything he managed to paint in 4 years in Paris, 40 canvases and 160 gouaches. His plan was simple. First, the exhibition in Berlin, and then he would leave his paintings with the gallerist for a few weeks and go to Vitebsk to see Bella. Now he would finally have something to offer her parents. Before the solo exhibition, Bolden also included Chagall's works in a huge group exhibition in 1913. Works by Picasso, Braque, Kandinsky, and Delaunay were displayed there. Against this background, Chagall's strangeness didn't scare people away. On the contrary, it made him stand out. Bolden saw that viewers and critics, even if they criticized, couldn't ignore Chagall's paintings. They provoked a strong emotional reaction. That's why he wasn't surprised when Chagall's solo exhibition was a tremendous success. However, Chagall didn't get to witness it. A couple of days after the exhibition opened, he went to Russia, and just a couple of weeks later, World War I began, closing all the borders of Europe and trapping Chagall in Russia for 8 years. Russia and Germany, being on opposite sides of the front and at war with each other, virtually cut off postal and all other communication. Therefore, by a tragic irony, Chagall, being in Russia, did not know about the tremendous success that this exhibition brought him. To jump ahead a bit, I'll say that Bolden will lose track of Chagall, being convinced that he had died, and will start selling the artist's paintings, which will sell like hotcakes. While Chagall himself will not even suspect that his name is becoming iconic, and he himself will fall into a creative impasse and a sense of uselessness in the new Russia. Only by the end of the war, after the revolution of 1917, will rumors start to reach him. Russian artists and critics miraculously returning from Europe will tell him, "Marc, in Berlin you are a god. Young people imitate you, your paintings hang in museums, and articles are written about you as a leader of Expressionism." Chagall will listen to this with disbelief. For him, living in conditions of hunger, devastation, and political purges, these stories will seem like fairy tales. But let's take it one step at a time. After returning to Vitebsk, Chagall visited his parents and of course saw Bella. But a couple of weeks later, World War I began. Martial law was declared in Russia. All men were forbidden to leave their settlements and the border was closed. Chagall was threatened with being drafted into the army. This was the most frightening thing that could happen to any family. And all of Vitebsk was running around looking for ways to protect their men. Marc Chagall even went to the local rabbi to ask for advice on how to avoid the army. He and Bella really wanted to get married, but her parents were strongly against it, and it took Chagall a lot of effort to convince them that he was a promising artist. And only the recent exhibition in Berlin and the support of an important man from St. Petersburg, Chagall's sponsor in Paris, Deputy Maxim Venever, finally made Bella's parents reconsider. And the outbreak of war, which brought uncertainty, along with Bella's persistence, did the rest. And the wealthy Rosenfelds reluctantly agreed to this, in their opinion, dubious union, which, however, would become their true salvation 2 years later. In 1915 they had a lavish wedding. In his book, Chagall describes how he felt like an outsider at this lavish celebration organized by his in-laws, with all these people dressed up and adorned with diamonds. But Bella was happy. She fully supported her husband from that moment until the end of her life. She was happy, the artist's main muse, not only inspiring him, but also approving all his paintings. However, the wedding did not save him from the threat of being drafted, and then Bella's brother, who held a good position in St. Petersburg, came to help. He secured a position for Chagall as a clerk in the Military Strategy Bureau at the Central Military Industrial Committee in Petrograd. This was an extremely fortunate solution because this position not only exempted Chagall from being drafted, but also allowed him and his wife to move to Petrograd, receive a government salary, and saved them from the hunger that was already gripping war-torn Russia. During the day, he worked at a job he hated, shuffling papers, and in the evening, he returned home to Bella and their newborn daughter, painting his warm fantasies and working on his famous painting Over the Town, the sketches for which he had created almost immediately after the wedding. This painting symbolizes everything most precious to the artist, his beloved wife and his dear Vitebsk, with the acknowledgement that Vitebsk's place in his heart had now been given to another. He didn't like Petrograd, this big and noisy city. Besides, anti-Semitism hadn't gone anywhere. After the 1905 revolution, and especially under martial law, patrols constantly roamed the city looking for suspicious people without documents. Some were killed on the spot and their bodies thrown into the Neva. One day, Chagall was stopped when he was returning from work. "Who are you?" "A Jew," they asked him. Chagall realized that he would be killed if he said yes. He fearfully showed his work ID and simply lied. They let him go. But he remembered this incident for a very long time as evidence of the completely humiliating and absurd situation in Tsarist Russia, a painter who had just exhibited in Berlin when a piece of paper protected him better than recognition. In 1915, Chagall began exhibiting his works in Moscow, in a well-known salon, and in 1916 in St. Petersburg as well. He again exhibited his works at the Moscow avant-garde art show. This brought him some recognition, and a number of wealthy collectors began to buy his works. But soon a new calamity befell Russia. Not only was the country involved in the war, but the February Revolution of 1917 broke out, which literally turned the country's entire established order upside down and brought many changes. И далеко не всегда позитивных. After the February Revolution, the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia during the October Revolution and declared Soviet authority. And with the coming of the new government, all restrictions and limitations on the rights of Jews were lifted. Lunacharsky, Chagall's old acquaintance from Paris, returns from France and becomes the first People's Commissar for Education. He immediately offers Chagall to lead the Department of Fine Arts at the People's Commissariat for Education in Petrograd, making him the top official for art in the country. If Chagall had agreed to take this position, perhaps his life and the fate of all Russian art would have turned out differently, but he refused. He had just freed himself from tedious bureaucratic work and realized that this was not at all what he wanted to do. And then Lunacharsky offered him the position of the Commissar of Arts in Vitebsk, tempting the artist with the possibility of building a utopian city where every poor person could learn painting. Of course, Chagall couldn't refuse such an offer. In September 1918, Chagall received his official certificate. Comrade Marc Chagall is appointed as the Commissioner for Arts Affairs in the Vitebsk province. Surprisingly, Chagall's humble origins became his advantage under the new government. The power of the workers and peasants became his power. He returns to Vitebsk as an important figure and immediately begins establishing an art school. He secures buildings, a budget, purchases equipment and materials, and fully immerses himself in the process of creating that very educational institution, the idea of which had captivated him. He wanted to create a free community of artists where young talents are not told what and how to do things, and where each of them searches for their own path. In other words, he wanted to give his students what he himself never had. And he was doing a great job. The school quickly filled with students and gained a good reputation. People came from all over Russia and the capitals to enroll. And soon it became one of the main centers of the avant-garde in Russia in the 1920s. The new government declared anything bourgeois to be its enemy. Everything associated with Tsarist Russia or wealth was considered hostile and subject to eradication. Power, especially at the local level, was desired by yesterday's uneducated workers and peasants, who were so far removed from aesthetics and art that the language of art was something foreign to them. The recently impoverished reveled in their newfound power and took it out on everyone who had been their boss just yesterday. Brave young men roamed around Vitebsk, dispossessing wealthy families. They also got to Chagall's well-off godparents. A gang of armed young men literally burst in. At Bella's parents' house, they held knives to the old folks' throats and took everything out of the house, including the silverware. And then they looted all 3 jewelry stores. They couldn't open the safes and came back the next day with a truck. They loaded the safes and took them away to saw them open, hoping to find treasure inside. They threatened to throw the old people themselves in jail or shoot them, so they had to ask for protection from Chagall, whom they had recently considered a bad match for their daughter. Of course, he helped them. Even in the art world, events occurred that shook its foundations. 2 years ago, in 1915, Malevich painted his black square as a contrast to everything natural, classical, and alive. And from that moment, suprematism and ultimate abstraction began to be opposed to classicism and academism. And after the revolution, even more broadly, all old art was declared bourgeois and hostile. This time is known as the dictatorship of the avant-garde. Suprematism, futurism, and constructivism were recognized as truly proletarian art. And Chagall, although technically belonging to the avant-garde, with his warm tones and serene stories, once again did not fit into the general revolutionary current. Even a stern avant-gardist once asked Chagall, "Mark Zakharovich, why are your cows green and people flying? What does this have to do with Marx and Lenin?" Chagall replied, "It's directly related. The revolution is flight and the renewal of nature." And this answer satisfied the minister. 2 years later, in 1919, Chagall invited Malevich to Vitebsk to teach at the People's Art School he had founded. Chagall aimed to unite top masters from various movements. But Malevich came not just to teach, but to preach suprematism as the only true religion of the new era, which was at odds with the artistic pluralism that Chagall was creating. Malevich was a charismatic leader, loud, rough, and a brilliant speaker, the complete opposite of the shy and stuttering Chagall. He quickly convinced the students that Chagall's art, with its goats, fiddlers, and emotions, was just old junk and sentimental Philistinism, and that the future belonged to non-objectivity, geometry, and collective work. The students, captivated by the idea of reshaping the world, began to leave Chagall's studio en masse and joined the group Unovis, the champions of new art, founded by Malevich. In June 1920, while Chagall was in Moscow buying paints, Malevich staged a coup by organizing a vote in which the school was declared suprematist. Chagall's studio was abolished as unnecessary, and Chagall himself was ordered to leave the school he had created with such love within 24 hours. Chagall was deeply hurt, but realized that it was useless to fight against fanatics. My students, whom I loved so much, betrayed me. They switched to Malevich because he promised them a new system, while I offered them only hard work and exploration, he wrote. And he writes a letter of resignation and leaves for Moscow. In Moscow, he was offered a job as a set designer at the newly established State Jewish Chamber Theatre. Once again, Jewish connections. He was supposed to start work at the beginning of 1921 with the production of several plays by Sholem Aleichem. For the opening, he created several large background frescoes depicting various lively scenes with dancers, violinists, acrobats, and of course animals. There had to be animals. One critic at the time called it Jewish jazz in colors. On the eve of the premiere, he was brought a pile of old clothes, and Chagall painted them by hand. At the same time, he began attending art gatherings. It was a time of fierce revolutionary bohemia, within which Chagall felt like an outsider. The loud Mayakovsky seemed deafening to him, while Yesenin, who was closer and more likable to him in spirit, was simply a drunkard, wasting his talent in taverns and scandals. And then Malevich returned from Vitebsk because without Chagall the school simply fell apart, and he threatened to hang him from a pole. Alexander Rodchenko called for the complete destruction of art, proclaiming the death of paintings. And David Sternberg, an artist and at the same time the head of the Fine Arts Department of the People's Commissariat for Education, told him, "You know, Mark, my wife and I now only paint chairs. Paintings are no longer needed. It's an anachronism." Can you imagine what a lean environment the quiet Chagall was in with his animal tales about Vitebsk? Many significant and interesting events were happening in Russian art then. I'll share them with you soon, so subscribe to stay updated. But revolutionary blindness and radicalization, unfortunately, made many ideas unviable, reducing them to a particularly sterile absurdity. And very often, just like with the school, the students who came to their senses ended up begging Chagall to come back. After playing around and realizing it was a dead end, the artist returned to more traditional forms. Even Malevich couldn't squeeze anything out of suprematism for long. Well, it's impossible to endlessly cut squares, rectangles and stripes. Suprematism will soon cease to exist, and Malevich himself will turn to primitivism, though in a form far more talentless than anything Chagall painted. Overall, Mark Zakharovich and revolutionary art didn't mix, and its representatives didn't get along with Chagall either. But it wasn't just art that the Bolsheviks were destroying. They were ruining the country as well. The country plunged into civil war, which was soon followed by famine. In 1921, a combination of severe drought and the consequences of the policy of war communism, the grain requisitioning that deprived peasants of their grain reserves and incentives to sow, led to a food shortage that affected 35 provinces. As a result, 5 million people died from starvation. The country was no longer concerned with art. Making a living from paintings became very difficult, and Chagall and his wife moved to Malakovka near Moscow, which took 2 hours to get to, but it was cheaper. The three of them, his wife, his daughter and himself, shared a single bed in an attic under the roof, barely fitting on it. I'll give you another excerpt from his book so you can hear firsthand the kind of horror the artist lived in. We found some trestles, put them next to the bed and made it a bit wider. The house still smelled of its former owners and illness. Medicine bottles were scattered everywhere, with dry dog mess here and there. The windows were always wide open, summer or winter. In the shared kitchen downstairs, a cheerful countrywoman bustled with the housework. She put bread in the oven and laughed, sincerely sharing stories of her adventures. During the famine, I transported sacks of flour in freight trains, somehow managing to get them from distant villages. And then one day, I ran into a police patrol, about 25 men, and I was alone in the carriage. They said, "Transporting flour is forbidden. There's a decree. Don't you know?" So I lay down, and all 25 men took their turn. I could barely stand afterwards, but at least my flour was safe. And I'm looking at her mouth. At night, she visited the basement where the foresters lived. Oh, I just hope they don't get the idea to come at us with axes. All those recent gloomy, hungry years in Moscow, he didn't paint, trying to find work, because they were living on the edge of starvation. He made ends meet by designing stage sets, making decorations, and doing small illustration jobs, trying to feed his family. So when he was offered a job teaching drawing at a children's colony in Malakovka, he agreed. Can you imagine an artist who was already famous, almost a cult figure in Europe at that time, working hard as an art teacher in a children's colony? Rumors of his success had already begun to spread, and like any reasonable person, the artist started thinking about returning to Paris. Chagall submits a request to leave the country, and while waiting for approval, he writes his autobiography, My Life, which is the basis for the story I'm telling you about this remarkable artist. At the end of the book, he writes, "Neither Tsarist nor Soviet Russia needs me. They don't understand me. I'm a stranger here. I'm bringing my wife and daughter. I'm coming to you for good. And maybe after Europe, my Russia will love me too." Lunacharsky helps him with a foreign passport and permission to leave, and Chagall leaves Russia with his family and will return here only once more, already a living legend. On his way to France, he first stops in Berlin to look for the paintings he left there 8 years ago. But every single one of them had been sold, and the money earned from the sales after the First World War, in which Germany was defeated, had become so worthless that he could only afford to buy himself a pair of shoes. That's how Chagall lost all his early works. But here he fully realized how popular he had become, how recognized he was, that he was even listed as a founder of Expressionism alongside Van Gogh. Upon returning to France, Chagall, now a well-known artist, though not yet recognized in the most demanding city in the world, Paris, quickly established business relations with the French art dealer Ambroise Vollard, who worked with such masters as Cézanne, Renoir, Picasso, Gauguin, and Van Gogh. He paints a lot, drawing on his memories of Vitebsk, staying true to himself now that no one expected him to do otherwise. In 1926, he had his first exhibition in the United States at the Reinhardt Gallery in New York, where about 100 of his works were presented, although he himself was not present at the opening. And only in 1927 did Chagall become famous in the French art world, when the art critic and historian Maurice Renal included him in his book Modern French Artists. Returning to Paris from one of his trips, Vollard commissioned Chagall to illustrate the Old Testament, and although he could have completed the project in France, he used this assignment as an excuse to go to Israel, where he spent as much as 3 months enjoying speaking with people in his native language. Upon returning to France, he began working on a series of engravings for the Bible, but by the start of World War II, he managed to complete only 66 out of 105. He would only finish them completely in 1956 when he returned from the United States. It would be written about him. The illustrations were stunning and received wide acclaim. Chagall в очередной раз показался one of the most important graphic artists of the 20th century. World War II began, and the Nazis captured France so quickly that 54-year-old Chagall, absorbed in his art, along with his wife and daughter, found themselves trapped. And when the persecution of Jews began again, the collaborationist French government started searching for naturalized French citizens of Jewish origin to send them to concentration camps. It was already too late. The United States, however, required a deposit from migrants to ensure they would not become a financial burden for the country, and tickets across the Atlantic became insanely expensive. But then, Varian Fry, an American journalist, and Hiram Bingham Thaw, the US vice consul in Marseille, organized an operation to evacuate artists and intellectuals from Europe to the United States. By providing them with fake visas, Fry and Bingham had already included Chagall in the list of such intellectuals and was just waiting for the coveted visa. But in April 1941, Chagall and his wife were stripped of their French citizenship. While waiting, the Chagalls stayed at the Modern Hotel in Marseille, where they were arrested along with other Jews. Varian Fry managed to put pressure on the French police to release the artist, threatening them with a scandal. Chagall was one of more than 2,000 people saved during this operation. He left France in May 1941, when it was already almost too late. On June 10, 1941, Chagall and Bella left Lisbon aboard the Portuguese ship Muzinho. Among the passengers were 119 refugee children to whom Chagall gave drawing lessons during the journey. In New York, he discovers that his fame has spread across the ocean, and that 2 years ago he was even awarded a prestigious art prize for his painting, The Bridegrooms. Pierre Matisse, the son of Henri Matisse, becomes his representative in the US and organizes an exhibition of Chagall's works in Chicago, which is a huge success. The critics write, Chagall is a true gypsy. These paintings do more for his reputation than anything we've seen before. His colors sparkle with poetry. His works are truly Russian, like the song of a Volga boatman. He is offered the chance to do the design for a ballet based on Pushkin's poem The Gypsies, which was planned to be staged in Mexico. Chagall arrived in Mexico and was fascinated by the local folklore, by its naivety, so similar to the Russian one. He found something very close to his own nature and personally developed all the color details and scenery, drawing on national patterns. As a result, he created 4 large backdrops, and Mexican seamstresses sewed the ballet costumes. The ballet was a tremendous success. Chagall was called back for an encore 19 times, and soon the ballet was staged in New York at the Metropolitan Opera itself, and the success was repeated. The critics wrote, "The ballet turned into a dramatized exhibition of giant paintings. It surpasses anything Chagall has ever done on an easel. And this is a breathtaking spectacle of a kind you hardly expect in the theater." And in 1944, Bella died from a streptococcal infection. She couldn't get penicillin, which was scarce due to the war. Her death stunned Chagall for a long time. He stopped painting, and when he returned to art, he dedicated his work to the memory of his beloved wife. Soon, his work was exhibited at the New York MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, the most renowned modern art museum in the world. But a year later, the war ended, and in the fall of 1946, 59-year-old Chagall hurried back to Paris, which had become his second home, and attended the opening of his solo exhibition at the National Museum of Modern Art, Pompidou. A solo exhibition at the Pompidou and MoMA is the pinnacle of what a modern artist can achieve. But there is also a grand prize. In 1963, Chagall was commissioned to paint the ceiling of the Paris Grand Opera. This appointment sparked heated debates. Not everyone liked the idea that a Russian Jew, and a modern artist at that, would be painting a French national treasure. It took the 77-year-old artist a year to complete the painting, and at the premiere, the hall was packed. The audience saw a ceiling divided into 5 color segments, paying tribute to composers Mozart, Wagner, Mussorgsky, Berlioz, and Ravel, as well as famous actors and dancers. After the unveiling of the new ceiling, even the most vocal critics of the commission seemed to fall silent. The press unanimously declared Chagall's new work a great contribution to French culture. After that, he created many more works that became his priceless legacy. Stained glass windows for the synagogue of the Hadassah Medical Center, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, a stained glass window called Peace for the United Nations building, a stained glass window in the Union Church, and 2 monumental frescoes that hang on both sides of the new building. The Metropolitan Opera at Lincoln Center in New York, and many others around the world from Switzerland to Israel. Marc Chagall's last work was a tapestry commissioned for the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago. The model of the painting called Job was completed, but Marc Chagall died shortly before the tapestry was finished in 1985 at the age of 98. And the tapestry was completed without his involvement. 13 years before his death, in 1972, Marc Chagall returned to Russia for 2 weeks at the invitation of the Ministry of Culture of the USSR for a solo exhibition organized in Moscow. He visited the Tretyakov Gallery and saw his paintings on the walls of the legendary museum, but he refused to go to Vitebsk. Jewish Vitebsk was completely destroyed by the Nazis, and all the Jews were sent to concentration camps. Out of the 260 people who lived in the city at that time, only 118 survived. The city that had lived in Chagall's soul for almost 100 years no longer existed. Khrushchev-era apartment blocks grew in place of the wooden houses, and Chagall did not want to destroy his naive, childlike, and even mystical memories that had inspired him throughout his long life. "I want the Vitebsk I left to remain in my memory." There are constant debates in the art community about whether Chagall is a Russian artist. But I'll tell you this, even the book by Chagall that formed the basis of my story was first translated by Bella from Yiddish into French and published in France in 1931. The Russian edition, translated from French, appeared in Russia only in 1990 after the artist's death. What Chagall achieved as a Russian Jew happened more in spite of Russia than because of it. France, on the other hand, gave him what he wanted so much, freedom to create. And it seems to me more honest to call him a French artist of Russian origin. Write in the comments what you think. Let's talk. Incredible story, isn't it? Friends, I have one request for you. I manage this channel alone, and each video requires a lot of work.
Поэтому они выходят так редко.
But together, we are creating the best art channel on the Russian internet. That's without a doubt, and I could really use your support. Please subscribe, even at the lowest tier, here on YouTube or on Boosty or Patreon. I'll leave the links in the description. Thank you for watching. Goodbye, everyone.